Good afternoon across the Atlantic in the United States, New York, California, Midwest. It is evening here in Jerusalem. Dan Diker, President, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, sitting here with my esteemed colleague, Special Envoy Jason Greenblatt, a JCPA Senior Fellow, as well as the former Special Envoy of the United States to the Middle East under the Trump administration. And we come to you just an hour after a dramatic event, the assassination of Hamas senior commander and political leader Saleh al-Arouri in Lebanon. And this is a very consequential development in the Iran-Hamas-Hezbollah war against Israel. And there's really no one better to discuss some of the key issues in the American-Israeli relationship at this critical moment. This is, Jason, wonderful to have you with us here at the JCPA, and great to have you here in Israel. This is, needless to say, it's a critical moment. We haven't seen this type of direct action since former President Trump actually sanctioned the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, one of the major Iranian regime commanders of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And what's your initial, your intuition about this particular development in light of your own service in the White House and the decision by former President Trump to engage in another type of targeted assassination of an arch enemy of the United States as well as of Israel?
This is so important. First of all, I'm glad to be here in Jerusalem, Israel. It's my first trip since October 7th. This is so important because this shows that Israel means business. Israel keeps its promises. Every terrorist around the world, in particular in the Middle East, who is vowing to destroy Israel, who is vowing to undermine the Middle East and take over parts of the Middle East, should be quaking in their boots. They should understand that they have a target on their back, that Israel means to come after them every which way they can. This is also a very positive thing for the Gulf states and other Arab countries that are either outwardly aligned with Israel or privately aligned with Israel, because Hamas and these terrorists are against them too. And they want nothing more than to take Iran, the biggest problem here. The Iranian regime wants nothing more than to take over their countries as well. And without Israel doing what it's doing for Israel's benefit, for the United States' benefit, and yes, for these Arab countries as well, the Arab countries will become a target one day.
Actually, it's a very interesting point, Jason, that you've made, that in a sense, this is a real unifying moment for the Saudi-led Gulf states, if you will, who have been, as we understand, they've been waiting on the side, watching very carefully as to who is going to win this war that right now is being played out in Gaza, but it's also being played out in Lebanon, and it's being directed from Tehran.
What people don't want to say out loud, and maybe some don't understand, is this is an existential threat for Israel. It's an existential threat for the region. Israel is doing the work of everybody with the backing of the United States, and of course, too many countries around the world are against it. But Israel has no choice. Israel must do it. Every single Israeli that I've spoken to over the last day and a half understands its threat, and the region needs to understand the threat.
Jason, I just came back from the Knesset literally 10 minutes ago, just as you and Avery, your son, walked in to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. We were at the Knesset caucus for Victory in Gaza, which is probably the second meeting of its kind. There were bereaved families there. There were members of Knesset. There were ministers there. Minister Gila Gamliel was there, the Minister of Intelligence. And the united position of everybody is, how do we determine victory? And how determined we are as a collective in Israel. And we talked about 10 million Israelis, including 7 million Jews and 2 million non-Jews, who in this particular moment are united, knowing that the forces of extremism, what they call the Nazified enemy, the ISIS-Hamas, ISIS-Hezbollah, are a threat to everybody in Israel, and as you say, to the larger Middle East. What's interesting here is what the former president determined when he issued in order to take out Qasem Soleimani is that the Middle East would would experience an earthquake. And in fact, what we saw in hindsight is that nothing happened. There was a degree of real relief, if you will, and I think that's what you're pointing to now, and from a regional standpoint.
It reminds me of when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital, when he moved the embassy. Say what you mean, do it. People respect you for it. Don't do things that are wrong, but do things that are right, do things that are historically accurate, protect your citizens, protect the region. The war that Israel is fighting, we have to say it over and over again, is not just Israel's war. It's not just the 9 million people that you mentioned. It's for the benefit of America. It's for the benefit of the region. It's for the benefit of anyone on this planet who wants to live a normal life as opposed to try to destroy life.
Clearly. And in fact, one of our senior analyst here, vice president actually of the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs, Aviram Belaish, mentioned as we were just going on the air, he said, as an Arabist, he said, remember the psychological effect of the assassination of al-Arouri on Lebanon itself. And the fact that it was done in Lebanon, it wasn't done in Gaza, and it wasn't done in a European country or another country, but it was actually done in Lebanon. What they call in Hebrew todati, the toda'ah, the perceptual effect, really is sort of a force multiplier.
I think Hamas and the Iranian regime in particular totally misjudged Israel's reaction to October 7th. And I think now they're going to understand the consequences of what they did, what they hope to do, and maybe this will knock some sense into all of their heads. So
then the question becomes, what is going to be the immediate and medium-term response to this? And that we've seen it can't really get much worse than the wholesale massacre that occurred on October 7th, which, by the way, has really been played very brilliantly, I must say, tactically by the Hamas and by their taskmasters in Tehran. They are masters in deception warfare, masters in disinformation. And here, as you said, you had a very direct response by Israel that has vowed, and we heard it in the Knesset now, to literally decapitate and kill every one of Hamas's senior leaders. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet have said so, and it really gives one pause to think that this is beginning to happen now.
It is, and I think one of the most important things people have to remember is that Israel is not just fighting in Gaza. We have the Hezbollah threat. What's going to happen now? Will Hezbollah be foolish enough to react to what happened? President Trump often gets criticized by the media because he said Hezbollah is smart. He's not trying to compliment Hezbollah. Hezbollah is smart. Frankly, Hamas is smart. They couldn't have pulled off October 7th if they weren't smart and professional in that twisted, distorted, evil sense. I'd like to think that Hezbollah is smart enough not to try to react to Israel, because Israel will punish them again and again if they try to react to what happened today.
Absolutely. And in fact, this is a proxy war. And what we were discussing in the Knesset just an hour ago is the failure of, I would say, Israel's public diplomacy, if I can be self-critical for a moment, and all the more so in the United States, to understand that what this war is. It's an Iranian regime war. It's an IRGC war that follows a radical Shiite eschatology that has to be understood as one integrated war. Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian regime and Hezbollah in Syria, Tehran itself, the Gaza front. It was made clear during the deliberations in the Knesset today, this is a 7-front war. So this is a particular moment in a 7-front war. How do you assess, compare, and contrast that particular strategic approach as it being a multi-front war, as opposed to the tendency among American administrations, particularly State Department, to look at each particular front as like that is the only conflict that's happening in town?
That's always been a problem in Washington. And look, I'm a Trump guy, and yet I find myself complimenting the Biden administration time and time again. I certainly have issues with them pushing a two-state solution now. Nobody should be talking about that at all. I have issues with them not publicly acknowledging Iran's role, the Iranian regime's role. But overall, I think they've been standing by Israel very, very much. And I think they finally understand it is a war of all of those fronts. It's a tremendous war. It's not just against Hamas. It's certainly not against the Palestinian people, but it's against the ideology of some Palestinians, too many Palestinians who want to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. And it's a fight of evil and good. And I think Washington, or at least this White House, gets it. But there's another front in the war, and you touched upon it, which is the PR war. I do think to give Israel credit, they have in this war done a very, very good job trotting out English-speaking, well-versed, compelling people who could tell the story to America, to the rest of the world. I have not seen it in prior wars. I think each and every one of them has done Israel a great, great service. But the war is just going to continue, and it's especially on social media. I'll give you a silly example. I tried TikTok for the first time because that's right here. All the young kids are hearing all these hateful things about Israel. I did a short video about the New York Times article about the sexual violence against Israel, which was a good article, especially one from the New York Times. My video was kicked off TikTok. And I didn't say anything other than read this article in the New York Times about sexual violence. There are social media channels. Two of my tweets today and yesterday got limited visibility because of X, formerly known as Twitter. There is a battle for our young people's souls, their minds, their hearts, and we have to fight that very, very hard.
How do you fight that? Because the Israeli story, whether it's a war or it's between the wars, as they say, it becomes a more complex narrative. It involves history. It involves, the history with Hamas itself. This is the sixth war against Hamas. Remember, at 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014. Then there was the continuing knife intifada, which involved Hamas in 2016, 17, 18. Then there was 2021, and here we are in 2023. How do you begin to compact messaging when there is such a sort of complex history to the whole conflict?
I don't let people get into the history. The history of the wars, you're right. But the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not relevant. October 7th is pure evil. There is no justification for it whatsoever, not an ounce of it. So for anybody that talks about, oh, but they had it coming to them, occupation and this and that, don't give them any oxygen whatsoever.
How do you understand the discussion? I mean, you having served in the White House and being inside the inner sanctum, if you will, with the president and with fellow diplomats, Ambassador Friedman was there frequently, and Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz after a while. And you have these internal conversations, and I just sort of transfer those conversations to today. How do we understand that the White House comes out, issues these consistent messages about two-state solution when we're on the back end of what arguably is the worst massacre, certainly of Jews, but of any minority in decades?
I suppose it's two things. First of all, people do believe that ultimately there must be a solution, and they like to believe that the two-state solution is that solution, as if they can wave this magic wand and the leader of Israel, the leader of the Palestinians, will sit down and come to terms on an agreement, totally ignoring things like October 7th, totally ignoring things like the pay-to-slay program that the Palestinian Authority has. In fact, the fact that they want to put the Palestinian Authority in charge of Gaza, this Palestinian Authority who pays rewards to Palestinians to harm and murder Israelis. And they don't even talk about that. It's shocking. But deep down, they think that those simple words is the magic formula to this. The second issue is there are a lot of people, unfortunately, that believe that Israel is the aggressor, that Israel is the occupier. And to go back to your earlier question, unless and until we completely change that narrative, and it's a very hard narrative to change, but unless and until we explain the reality that I lived for 3 years, my colleagues lived for 4 years, the names that you mentioned, until we can explain the truth, we don't have a hope of changing hearts and minds.
Well, you've touched upon a critical point here, Jason, in changing that narrative. In fact, the Knesset discussion was the importance not of what people say out there in the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the European Union, or whether it's in the UN, that keeps attacking Israel as an apartheid country and all of this sort of buzzword propaganda that has no basis, not in law, not in fact, not in history, not in anything. But that is the reality today in America, as you attest to when you go on, certainly when you go on Twitter all the time. How does one begin to change this narrative, which is so deeply rooted in people's consciousnesses of Israel as the heavy, of Israel as the libels, Israel as the colonialist, Israel as apartheid became this sort of standard. It's not even a question among some of our young people in the United States. How does one go about changing this decades-old inveterate mendacious narrative.
I'll tell you my method, and I use it in America. I use it throughout the Middle East. I use it in all my Q&A sessions. One is to get it's really to give real examples. So the first example I would go to, for those people that are saying there needs to be a fully sovereign Palestinian state, our answer, and the reason we didn't put one in our peace plan that President Trump released, was because we were afraid, not of October 7. I don't think any of us could have imagined October 7, that extreme event. But we were always afraid that the Palestinian public, a certain portion of them, were always going to have people who wanted to destroy Israel. How could you give a Palestinian state full sovereignty and not give Israel the security control that it needs? And my go-to line was, if you're saying that a sovereign Palestinian state could lead to a danger to Israel, now I can say to October 7, you're crazy. What country would ever agree to that? Why should America ever ask one of its most important allies to do that? And 99% of the time, the person backs down because they get it when you give a concrete example. The second example I'll give, which is also very important in light of October 7, there was this plan called the General Allen Plan. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. So when I was in the White House, I got briefed by just about every agency in the government saying, you know, Israel does not need to take control of the Jordan Valley. We have this great plan. It relies on all of these electronic devices and cameras and monitoring things. Everything is perfect. It's all electronic. Now, I'm not a military guy. I'm also not a computer genius, but I had two questions for those guys. I said, okay, just let me ask you a question. What if there's a blackout?
Like there was on October 7th.
Right, but like a real blackout,
Yeah.
Forget that, right? The second is, what if they hack it? You know, what if they completely take control of the cameras, and instead of seeing, you know, because you watch movies, you read books, you don't have to have such a wild imagination. But October 7th showed us they could do it even more simply, and they completely knocked it out. So people who push Israel to do things that are not realistic, if you give them a real example, any intellectually honest person is going to take a step back and understand that the problem is far more complex than saying, oh, the General Allen Plan or oh, two-state solution. These issues are going to take forever, not forever, but a long time to negotiate and figure out if we even get to that table. But anybody who just throws out the pithy phrase, they don't understand Israel, they don't understand the Palestinians, the conflict, or frankly, the entire region.
You know, Jason, Israel's national security concept has always been based, certainly since 1967 and the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel was attacked by 4 of its Arab neighbors, that it would only defend itself by itself. It would not submit to any even well-meaning, well-intentioned recommendations of international forces. The UN has proved itself to be an utter security failure. We see it in Lebanon. A little bit better in Sinai, but in utter failure in southern Lebanon. They actually are a helper. They are sort of helpmates of the Hezbollah, who are now, right now, as we speak on this Zoom, they are breathing over the fence, and you know, that's why we have 120,000 residents of the northern communities that are no longer there. They are frightened of a potential Hamas massacre in the style of the October 7th Hamas massacre. So that's number one, is that Israel is really needs to focus on this particular national security concept all the time, say it will only defend itself by itself, no electronic monitoring devices instead of troops on the ground, or demographic, or what we call defensible borders, which is the demographic high ground that Israel always needs to defend itself from Judea and Samaria. But here is another question. When we talk about narratives, diplomacy, messaging, two-state solution, what about the notion that it's time for Israel to start going negative on its opponents, something that is not natural to American foreign policy or American public diplomacy? Meaning, I talked about it just now in the Knesset, what's called the Jerusalem room in the Knesset, which I'm sure you've been in there actually a number of times, which is, we call it Nazifying the Hamas and Hezbollah enemies. While they talk about denazifying Gaza as a prerequisite to having what hopefully will be a peaceful society there at some point of some 1.5 million to 2 million people, the notion of actually going negative and blackening the true nature of the enemies that we face in the south and on the north, could that work in terms of changing the way the narrative is perceived, going from defense to offense, media, rhetoric, diplomacy, political, international organizations.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, let's be honest. The Palestinians did that to Israel. Since they started their PR war, all they've been doing is painting Israel as the occupier, the oppressor. Every bad word in the book, that's what they call Israel. All of it false, right? I think it's essential. I think people don't understand Hamas. It used to be that Hamas threw some missiles, right? Few people died. Okay, in an average person's mind who doesn't live here, understand it, breathe it, they think, okay, not so bad. Every single atrocity should be exposed. Every Hamas person should be exposed. Everything that they do, that they stand for. And by the way, they have destroyed Palestinian society. Gaza would never be perfect until there's a peace agreement, but Gaza could have been something reasonable, something that Palestinians could have created a reasonable life for themselves. Now it's completely destroyed. It was destroyed before Israel, not in a physical sense, but an economic sense. Now it's more than that. Hamas should be painted for exactly what it is. Hezbollah should be painted for what it is. Lebanon was once a beautiful country. I have met
the Paris of the Middle East.
Exactly. I have Lebanese friends who they cannot believe what happened to their country. And all of it is because of evil people who want to destroy progress, who want to destroy prosperity, security, stability, being able to raise their kids to play football, soccer, we call it, things like that. That's who we're fighting. That's who most of the countries in the region want to fight. And we should use every means in our disposal to expose Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian regime for what they are.
Absolutely. In fact, as we extend this discussion, we'll share some of the things that came up in the Knesset discussion, which were really actually surprising to me, and it was on the record, so it's not secret or confidential, and that there is a position in the Israeli body politic and in the Knesset, without mentioning specific names of members of Knesset who they're advocating for Israel to, on the one hand, to not only re-enter Gaza, repopulate and rebuild Gaza, but actually have a Jewish public rebuilding homes and neighborhoods in parts of Gaza where we were until 2005, when there was a unilateral pullout of Gaza, which actually to me was sort of a controversial moment. I personally never assumed that Israel would even think about sending Israelis back into Gaza, rather disconnecting from Gaza, which is former Chief of Staff Moshe Yaalon said, we never really disconnected from Gaza. We supply them with utilities and we supply them with electricity and supply them with water. And so there is this sort of ongoing, rather dramatic discussion between populating them with Jews and even annexing it and having Arabs as well, Palestinian Arabs or Gazans live there, but under Israeli government or control and military control, versus the other side, which is no. This is what is known as enemy territory, or that's what it's called now, but it would be a separate, autonomous region, let's say, that would be governed and managed only by the Palestinians. How do you feel about, how do you sense this discussion?
On this one, I'm going to put my diplomat hat on. Like the investigation of how October 7th happened, which is going to be deferred, like the discussion that's a legitimate discussion, do you let Palestinians into Israel now to work?
Yeah.
Given that many of them from Gaza who were let in ended up being spies for Hamas. I think it's a discussion, but I think it's a discussion that's not for today. And I do think it would be extremely challenging to do. I'm not saying I'm not for it. I'm not saying I'm against it, but I think it would be complicated. That said, if it's the only way Israel could actually maintain security for itself and for the Palestinians and actually give those Palestinians a better life, which they haven't had under Hamas rule, and I don't think they would get under PA rule, I think pitching it and discussing whether it's realistic and appropriate is something that can happen.
Yeah.
In terms of a discussion.
So that discussion can happen, and another discussion actually should happen, and that discussion is what Vahid Beheshti, who is a very prominent London-based Iranian Brit opposition activist, said, in the room, referring to our room, the Knesset, there is an elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is called the Iranian octopus, the Iranian regime octopus, what they say in Hebrew, the Tamnun Irani, which is, if we can imagine for a moment, as Vahid asked everybody in the Knesset plenum to imagine, an octopus with many tentacles, and the tentacles are in Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they're in the Houthis in by the Red Sea, in North Yemen, the Hamas in Gaza and others in Iraq, as well as in Syria. The head of the head of the, well, they say the head of the snake, but they say the head of the octopus is in Tehran. And the question really becomes, what in your assessment, I'm asking you to put on sort of your analyst hat right now, as opposed to your diplomat's hat. What is behind the fears versus the intelligence that the Biden administration has that that is the heart of the problem, or the bowels of the problem, and may now be an opportune time, as former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett actually revealed publicly in the Wall Street Journal recently, to start attacking whether it's military installations, nuclear installations, what they call water, what they call uranium enrichment, water enrichment installations in Tehran and in Iran itself.
Unfortunately, I think it's a few things. First of all, it's a little bit of an Obama era holdover. There are some in the administration who think that Iran wants to give its people, the Iranian regime wants to give its people good lives, right? You pay them enough money, you sign a deal, JCPOA point, whatever. They'll eventually become good people and everybody will be able to rest easy and the region will become peaceful. That's not the way it works. They have a complete misunderstanding of the Iranian regime, distinct from the Iranian people whose lives have been shattered by the Iranian regime. The second issue that they have is, even before the fact that we're going into an election cycle, is just generally this administration is not interested in getting into any kind of war or confrontation. And if they could keep the temperature low, sort of what Israel did in Gaza for a long time, if they could keep the temperature low, that's better than confronting something that deep down they understand, but they don't really want to deal with it. They call it ostrich diplomacy. They put their head in the sand and they figure everything will be okay around them and their time will be up. The third real practical issue now is we're about to go into an election cycle. Nobody wants to go into an election cycle in the middle of a war. I think Israel has to assume, I'm not saying for sure, I don't have insight into the Biden administration, but I think Israel has to assume that the Biden administration will not be with them in any kind of meaningful attack on the Iranian regime. The things that you're speaking about, they may sign off on, but I don't know that the Biden administration is willing to be as serious and as strategic and as forceful as Israel needs, and frankly, as America needs and as the region needs.
You know, there is a controversy, or a difference of opinion within Israel, whether it's just a matter of time before Israel has to undertake a major military operation in Lebanon, because of the fact that there are 190,000 rockets and laser-guided missiles in Beirut and in the south, of course, and even in the north, that could hit many strategic installations, residential buildings in the home front in Israel. And I'm thinking, was the assassination of, as we understand it from, I don't know if, I just got back, I'm not even sure if Israeli media reporting on this, or is it just foreign media? Israeli media is reporting on whether this is a signal to Iran that if they don't have the Hezbollah pull back to the Litani River, as per UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which has gone unenforced by the UN and unenforced also by the Western Alliance, whether this is a signal and a warning that perhaps they better change course and pull back to the Litani, and could it have that kind of effect, or is that putting a Band-Aid on cancer? And in fact, this is just a warm-up into what we very well may see in the coming months, is a major operation in Lebanon.
I'm afraid that Israel will have no choice but to have an operation in Lebanon. If they do pull back, that's good. It's another reason, by the way, why Israel has to fight its own wars by itself, for itself. But I don't think this is going to change Hezbollah's mind and its very reason for the existence of Hezbollah. So I think it'll buy us some time, but I don't think it will. I don't think it'll have the effect of running with their tail between their legs.
As we sort of wind up our discussion, share some of your thoughts. You have very good relationships throughout the Arab world, even in countries that have been involved in the negotiations for freeing hostages in Israeli hostages in Gaza. What are the prospects for retracking the Abraham Accords and expanding the Abraham Accords in the middle of this morass, this big mess that we have in the Middle East? Is there going to be a point in which we get signals from the Saudis, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, the Moroccans, even the Sudanese, come on, guys, let's continue this process. We were very close to signing, according to His Excellency Mohammed Salman, we're signing an agreement with the Saudis. How do you see from your many scores of trips to the region? Give us your sense of the pathway back to the Abraham Accords and beyond.
I think in the midst of a war, especially at this intensity, at this level of intensity, it's going to be hard. And again, President Biden is about to enter a very, very tough election. So he's going to have to make a decision. Does he want to be distracted by something like this, which could be an amazing coup for him and maybe even help in the election? Or does he focus entirely on all the problems America has right now, of which we have many, and his election cycle? So I wouldn't bet money on it. That said, you never want to say never. Even the Abraham Accords, we spent multiple years building, planting seeds, sort of nurturing, and then boom, it happens. So I never lose hope. I'm always the optimist.
Professor Bernard Lewis, of blessed memory, who was a teacher of ours here at the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs, used to say, nothing surprises him in the Middle East, and everything surprises him in the Middle East from day to day.
Yeah.
So any parting thoughts?
The blessing and the curse.
The blessing and the curse of living in the ancient and modern Middle East. Your final thoughts, having come from America, being here with your son Avery for the week, and having a couple of other engagements. What's your sense about where we are now?
I think if I had to distill it into one word, I was inspired. I mean, I toured many Air Force bases today. I met a lot of airmen and women, and how they're acting, the heavy hearts that they have, but nevertheless, their focus, their dedication, their understanding of the mission. It's not just protecting Israel. Let's not kid ourselves. They're protecting Jews around the world. So I'm glad I came. I leave here deeply inspired. Well,
what a great and positive message. We're delighted to have you at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs as a senior fellow in charge of and responsible for our larger Arab-Israeli diplomacy, and we hope very much as we continue moving forward together with our mutual friends, the Tratt family, who've been so deeply helpful, all strategically and supportive of our joint efforts together. So we thank them, we thank you, and thank our audience for this very stimulating, positive, and inspiring discussion. So Special Envoy Jason Greenblatt, thank you very much for giving us your time, and we look forward to much more and a lot of cooperation in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again tomorrow at the regular time, 9 a.m. First coffee of the morning Eastern Standard Time, and even earlier for